Hi, everyone. My name is Paul Morgan Stetler, and I want to welcome you to Conversations with Curtis. Back in 1996, I played Curtis Craig in Sierra Online's Phantasmagoria 2. And nowadays, I am playing some of these classic games for the very first time and talking to the people who made them. And today, I want to welcome you to part 2 in our series of technical interviews conducted by my partner, Daniel Albu. This is a series where Daniel gets to talk to programmers and engineers of some of your favorite classic games and talk to them about their involvement in bringing these games to life. We started with a great interview that he had with Aaron Giles a couple weeks ago. That went extremely well, and we're following up today with Brad Taylor. Brad Taylor worked for LucasArts and Humongous Entertainment via his work on the SCUMM engine, and he is responsible for bringing a number of your favorite games to life. Games such as Day of the Tentacle, Secret of Monkey Island, LeChuck's Revenge, some of those great putt-putt games and the backyard baseball and football and all that stuff. He has worked on so many games, it's crazy. He and Daniel are going to be talking today about SCUMM. They'll probably be talking about spit and phlegm and mucus and things like that. It's going to be a great interview. So please enjoy today's installment of Dialogue with Daniel with Brad Taylor.
Hi, everyone. If you've ever played a 90s adventure game, chances are that some of the tools that were used to create it were developed by today's guest. Brad Taylor, welcome to Conversations with Curtis.
Hello. How you doing?
I'm
you're
fine.
not Curtis.
I'm not Curtis.
Okay.
So it's Conversations with Curtis without Curtis.
All right.
So first of all, Happy New Year.
Happy New Year.
How were the holidays?
Oh, excellent. Did absolutely nothing, which was exactly what we had planned. So that was perfect.
Sounds like a plan to me. Doing nothing is a plan.
Around here, it is a plan. The complete silence and nothing, that is golden.
I know how to appreciate silence myself. Okay, so before we get to the amazing tools that you've worked on that helped create some of the most classic adventure games ever released, I want us to start at the beginning. How did you get into programming?
Oh, well, that kind of not haphazardly. A friend of mine had gotten a computer for his birthday or something like that, and I had been glued to it thanks to this adventure game called Advent or Advent.exe, Colossal Caves Adventure. And I just played that, well, every opportunity that I had over at his house. And I just begged my parents for a computer after that. So I knew exactly what I wanted to do. I wanted to build something like that because I had played video games in the arcade and I'd played Atari 2600 and all of that. But something about the adventure game genre just drew me in. So I got into it from wanting to make something like a mimicry, if you will.
And what was the first game that you developed?
The first game that I developed was probably along the lines of Pong or something along that lines. I mean, I had typed in plenty of basic computer games from the big basic book of computer games and other things from like Compute magazine. But the first one I did was probably Pong, if I remember right. It was using the balloon from the Commodore 64 example. I believe I didn't actually make any custom graphics. It was, balloons bouncing back and forth or something along those lines.
In which programming language did you use?
It was BASIC. I used BASIC probably for the first year of my coding experience. This was early 80s. It wasn't until I really started wanting to do games that had, fast graphics and whatnot. And then at that point, I went to assembly language. And just like everybody else in 6502, once you graduated past BASIC, it was, most likely you were going to 6502 directly.
And after you've tried out all of these clone games that you've created, did you start working on your own game, or you kept working on clones of other games until you've taken your first job?
Well, I created kind of a parser, if you will. It was pretty limited in comparison to today's parsers that would handle sentence structure and allowed you to, give it simple commands and whatnot. Um, Turns out that I ended up just building lots of tools during this. I actually never got to the game portion of my adventure game. I built things to, you know, whatever you want to call it, describe the environment, save it out on well, at the time it was tape drive, so it was really painfully slow to save. So I would code for an hour and then save. Maybe code another hour and then save because it was painful. But yeah, no. So the very first couple games that I did um, came late, not late 90s. I did some games then too, but it was the late 80s where I did my own first kind of puzzle games and whatnot that weren't somebody else's uh, content. Before I got hired at LucasArts, I was a lab assistant at a local college, and I did lots of little contract work, if you will, with local students. They would come and say, "Hey, why don't you tutor me or um, help me build this database that we have at our video rental service or whatnot." There wasn't any games until probably '89 was the first game that I ever actually really, I would say, put put thought into how it really should go and whatnot. Performance wise, nice looking, good playing. I was obsessed with Tetris, just like everybody else in the late '80s. I wanted to build something like that, and I came across a game from somebody out of Berkeley. It was called Columns, and they had just uploaded, and it was really quite primitive. It wasn't, the Sega Columns. It was very blocky, really thin display. And it really frustrated me that I couldn't rotate the pieces and that it didn't support diagonals. And that frustrated me to no end. So I basically built my own version and liked it much better. And that was kind of my first real game that I released that anybody could still play.
And
The
where
stuff on
did
the
you
console.
release it?
It was called Beyond Columns,
No,
and it
where
was,
did you release it?
oh goodness, it was a local BBS. I can't remember which one it was. The fact that it still made the rounds a little bit was kind of surprising. I did see some people playing it or mention of playing it later on. But so BBSs were the thing back in the day. It was a really, really small, tiny game. I think it was maybe 80K in size. And I released a sequel to that, which I titled Fallout, and a horrible name in retrospect. But that one was after I had kind of gotten my tooling down and whatnot, and it came out at 25K. So the sequel had much better graphics and performance and all of that, and it was tiny.
And do
That's
you
what
still have these games? Do you still have the source code?
I don't have the source code, but they are up on archive.org, which is kind of neat that you can actually play them in
Hmm.
a DOS box live on the internet, which is outstanding. The fact that we can emulate machines at such a in such accurate ways is amazing to me. And yeah, being able to play them today is cool.
Yeah, I was just talking to Aaron Giles, who also worked at LucasArts, and he's deep into emulation, and he described the entire process of emulating DOS nowadays. So it's really a marvelous thing. And when did you start working at the LucasArts games, and how did that come about?
Well, I had been working at as a lab assistant. I helped fix printers and do that sort of thing, help people with homework, hand out diskettes. you know. And the lab coordinator got a notice from LucasArts, or Lucasfilm Games at that point, that they were looking for game programmers and game testers. And this was around May or so in 1990. And I wrote a long, rambling, um, well, long for me. It was probably pretty short now in retrospect. Um, just what I thought my core talents were, the things that I could do and I could bring to life. And I made a really cool demo. I took apart the Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade game, and I grabbed screen captures of that and turned it into a little demo that was throwing things around a little bit more excitingly than what they had done, and I hoped it demonstrated you know um, something that they would want, and brought that with me to my interview, and they they never looked at it. um,
They
but
they really never looked at it?
They never looked at it. They didn't want unsolicited games or things like that. So they, talked around it and talked about, well, what did you do? And I described it. And but I was really disappointed that they didn't actually look at it because I'd spent quite a number of hours making something that looked good.
If I recall correctly, the intro for Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade is the Indy walking on the train,
Yes,
and you have the credit sequence with I think instead of Lucasfilm Games, it has Lucas Fun Circus or whatever,
right.
and so you made that scene interactive.
I made it do lots of bouncing and scrolling around. It was already scrolling, obviously, and that fascinated me. And I believe that they had the Lucasfilm logo clipping as well, where they had uh, graphics going on the inside of that. And I thought that was really clever. So I did a lot of bouncing sprites around on the inside of the logo, clipping to the logo geometry,
Oh, cool.
and it was kind of fun. Um, let's see. So that was in May, and I sent in my rambling letter, and I didn't hear back for a couple weeks, and I got a call from David Fox, um,
The David
and
Fox.
the David Fox, and he talked with me for probably for about 15 minutes, and said, "Okay, well, why don't you come in for an interview?" And I went in for an interview, and I met all kinds of people. Some of them I don't remember their names. It was like a blur, the not support staff, but the kind of business side of things. This is the person in accounting. I met some of them, but the people that blew my mind were the people that were working on the games, and I met Jenny Sward, Tim Schafer, Dave Grossman, Ron Baldwin, Eric Wilmunder, and Ron Gilbert, as well as David Fox that day. And they kind of group interviewed me at one point where I was, in their office, and there's like 3 or 4 people all tag team questioning me, uh, which was it was kind of nerve-wracking, at the time, because I didn't know what to expect. It was like the first real job um, interview that I had ever had. So I was, of course, a nervous kid, and that
Meeting one
was
of these people is nerve wracking. So meeting all of them in
yes,
one day.
yes, and to me at the time, I was 20, and I thought these guys were all in the same age range. I figured they were all in their early 20s as well. Some were in their late 20s. But for me, I was blown away that these people had so much experience. years and years of experience, and I had relatively nothing, um, and that they were, wanting to see what I could do and whatnot. And I was trying to impress them as much as I could. I probably rambled much like I'm doing now.
Well, at least you succeeded at convincing them that you had the skills to work on these
I
games.
did. David Fox let me uh, talk to him at length about the projects that they're working on and all of that. And I went away from that absolutely wanting the job. I mean, obviously, who wouldn't want a job at Lucasfilm Games? Um, but it was killing me the time between the interview and a call back. It seemed like forever. Um, but
So what was the date you started working at
it
Lucas?
was June. I think it was June 6th of June on 90. And
Okay, so a few months after
yeah,
Loom
pretty sure
was
that was it.
released, right?
Yes, they had released Loom not too long before uh, I had started there, and they were working on not Maniac Mansion, Zach McCracken for the FM Towns, and they were also building Monkey Island at that point. Um, it was just about halfway done when I came in,
Okay.
and it was all EGA, which was uh, kind of the target for the day. The FM Towns was uh, 256 color, and it was beautiful. I remember marveling at the colors in that.
So when you arrived in June, what was the first task they gave you to
Uh,
do?
the first ta- the first task was SCUMM U. They had a number of other people that they had hired on as kind of like a second wave of SCUMM programmers, um, and that was Tammy Borowick, Tony Shea, Hal Borrowwood, Sean Clark, and Mike Stimley. All were hired the same day, and we had a room that was in the attic of Skywalker Ranch. We had a little kind of like a little square of tables set up, and Ron or Dave or Tim would get up there and talk about building games in the SCUMM system, what the tools were, how you define variables, kind of what the strategy of building software was that they had. So my first week was SCUMM U. Um, and about a little bit into the second week, I got taken aside and said, "We want you to work on something else." So I'm not sure if it was they wanted to, make sure that I could program as well as uh, I said I could, but they had me write some assembly versions of the actor drawing routines, and it was, I think, kind of a test to see how I would do. And it was all in C originally, and I built uh, x86 assembly versions of them that were completely plug-in compatible. So you could just call my function instead of their function, and it was perfectly a perfect test bed, if you will. It was something that had high frequency calls. It was called every frame, so it would be exposed very quickly whether it was working correctly or not. And that was the first piece of professional code that I wrote, was assembly language actor scaling drawing routines for the EGA card.
And
Um,
what exactly entailed that function? What did you do exactly?
well, it would take the actors, which were drawn, stored vertically, and it would had like a horizontal step table, that would you'd say what scale you were at, and it would kind of do a not a Bresenham, but a not fixed point either. It was a kept a running tally of how far it had gone in the actor's position, and it would either step the destination pointer or not step the destination pointer. So you can see the actors as they move along. They kind of scale in a kind of a bizarre by today's standards, but it was meant so designed such that it would remove a um, like a scan line or a vertical line, and do that incrementally. So once a scan line was removed, it didn't just flicker back and forth between it. Um, it was kind of a subtle scaling, or as a naive approach to it would have been just sample the uh, actor at a certain rate, and then it would kind of flicker back and forth. They didn't want that, so they had designed it with this interesting line removal algorithm. Um, and since they had working C code, that was what I started with. And I, sat down and with a printout of it, and I just, started in whichever editor it was. I think it was it wasn't line edit, but it was something really primitive at the time.
It's interesting that this feature is the first thing, the feature you're talking about, the scaling, is the first thing you see at the beginning of Secret of Monkey Island, when Guybrush goes down the mountain path and onto the dock. Because if I remember correctly, up until that point, if a character had to change size while it was in a certain room, they used some sort of trickery by having the character walk behind something and then come out the other side in a larger form. Because, like you said, there was no scaling at the time. I remember it from Loom, for example. You have the Dragon's Cave, and when Bobbin goes down the stairs, then he goes behind a pillar and then comes out the other end larger. And same goes for Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. So they've taken your feature and placed it at the beginning of Secret of Monkey Island. So well
Yeah.
done.
Yes, I think that they had many different attempts at an opening, and that just happened to be what they landed on. Um,
Now, when discussing LucasArts adventure games, people usually mention SCUMM, of course, but there's an entire world of tools that were used to create SCUMM games and its runtime, basically. Can you walk us through all of the tools that are used to create these SCUMM
oh,
games?
sure. Um, there's a lot of different tools, as you can imagine. Um, there's the compiler, which shares the name as the system. It's SCUMM. It's the script creation utility for Maniac Mansion. And the SCUMM system and the SCUMM compiler shared that name. So when you talk about SCUMM, you could be talking about the language, or you could be talking about the entire system. Usually people just called it the SCUMM system. So let's see, what did we have? There was the SCUMM compiler, obviously, and that was kind of like a compiler linker type of utility or program. Then we had Mucus, which would take the art from Deluxe Paint and it would compress it and take the Z planes, which are the clipping elements that you could clip the characters behind. And there was another tool called Phlegm. It was a tool that let you take the room layouts and define which objects were interactable, what their verbs were, whether or not it had an associated Z plane, and it had the control for walk boxes inside of it. So you would lay out that graphically where you could walk little quadrilaterals, if you will, that you could, um, as long as they met up at a horizontal or vertical um, place, it would allow you to walk smoothly between them, which was really cool. We had another program called Bile. That was kind of the big uh, tool for me because it was their animation and choreography tool, and it um, had layers and a horizontal timeline and these little bitty um, tokens that you could put in there for, like, does this turn at this point? Does it set a flag? Does it trigger a sound? Those sort of things. Um, let's see, what else did we have? Um, we had a program called Spit. It was for designing fonts. I think we may have designed 3 or 4 fonts the entire uh, time. I think there might have been 3 or 4. Yeah, uh, a whole tool for 3 or 4 fonts. Not not per, uh, not a wise investment of time, but um, let's see. We also had a color tool. I'm kind of mixing timelines in here. Some of these tools are things that I worked on. Some of them are things that existed before. Um, we had this program called DK, which is kind of an art tool that would take high color art, if you will, 256 color art, and squish it down for other platforms. Like the Amiga could display a wonderful palette of 32 colors, but it couldn't display 256 the way the VGA card could. Not in the same way. I mean, it could display 4,096 colors. However, there were some rules to how it displayed them. Um, so we opted for reducing the colors from 256 down to 32. And that was DK. We had another set of animation tools. One was called You Sweat, and the other one was called You Smell. One was the thing that you would annotate your Deluxe Paint Animator files in, and the other one would compress it. Um, let's see, what else did we have?
It seems like you came up with the names before you came up with the actual tools.
Yeah, it's some of them. With the You Sweat and You Smell, that one was a joke. iMuse had come out, and it was just unbelievably amazing technology. And I, for whatever reason, thought it'd be funny to have a little spoof on the name. You know, iMuse. Well, first you sweat, then you smell. Really, sort of a little bit of humor, if you will. Kind of
Now,
lame.
now you mentioned iMuse. Monkey Island 2 introduced the iMuse system. What changes had to be made in the way music was being played in SCUMM in order to integrate the iMuse system?
Oh, well, on the engine side, Eric and Ron were the kind of leads of the tech on that, so they integrated iMuse, and there was actually before iMuse, the API for talking to the sound card was relatively meager. I mean, we didn't have a lot of sounds. I mean, we triggered music, which was beeps and boops, if you will, on the PC speaker, and I think Loom had MIDI sound. Yeah, it did have MIDI sound.
Yeah, kind of ad-lib.
Adlib, yeah. And the kind of the API that uh, they built for iMuse was a little bit more robust, to say the least, and it still used MIDI internally, but had all kinds of nice branching structures so that you could take the music and set up a transition, if you will, to response to something somebody did inside the game or some animation event, and it would seamlessly transition between 2 different. I don't remember what they called it. Well, it's not important. It would transition smoothly between different pieces of parts of the music in a way that made the transition seamless, so that you wouldn't notice. It wouldn't be this sound stops. It just kind of fades away, and the new piece kind of um, is introduced slowly in a non-jarring way.
So every room had its own musical theme, and
It
you'd
did,
have the
Monkey Island.
transition that would have to align with the musical track from one room and the other, and then play that transition when entering a certain room
Yes,
at a
it would
certain time.
at a certain time, pre-planned and non-jarring. And then other places, like there's a skeleton dance, which is fairly elaborate, and it has all kinds of timing cues, and the audio and the actors respond to each other um, in a way that hadn't been done in our games before. Not even sure that it had been done in other people's games. I think Wing Commander might have been a little earlier in the interactive music streaming, um, but not by much. It was really new technology at the time, and
Now I understand that not that many people appreciated iMuse because nobody noticed it.
they they noticed it years later, but at the time, I don't think it was appreciated for just how remarkable it was. It was, we appreciated it internally because we could hear it and we could see it, and we had experienced its growth and the um, time that it came about. So we had a huge appreciation for it, but I don't think the audience was on board with it yet. Not for many years. I mean, once it became clear that building software that transitions audio like that is very costly. We had to dedicate engineering to that, not just on the side of iMuse, but the animation control and the integration in the SCUMM scripts that required engineering. It wasn't something that just came for free.
In addition to the timed animation, for example, it talked about the parents' skeleton dance, and
Right.
that required timing the animation. But were there any other times where animation had to be timed?
Let's see. I'm trying to think if there was an
Because I
on.
know that sometimes the game would wait. For example, Guybrush would try to go somewhere, and the game would wait for you to reach a certain point in the track in order to move to the next room. One example of that is in the swamp, the voodoo lady. So you go in the swamp
The
and you enter
pan.
the skeleton, the skull, and Guybrush waits there for a few seconds, and then he plays the musical cue, and then he goes up.
Yes,
So
that was a combination of things. Actually, there was a lot of data loading. The next room was being loaded, the objects were being loaded, as well as the musical sync. Absolutely. Uh, I'm trying to think. There were some musical transitions in the dock area where the cook and the guys sitting there are.
yeah, in Woodtick there are many
Woodtick,
transitions.
yes.
Woodtick is the best example of iMuse because every place you enter has its own musical theme, and it aligns with the Woodtick musical theme. Like instruments are fading in and fading out. So it was really impressive. I remember when I played with Paul Curtis, when I played Monkey Island 2 with him, we sat in Woodtick, and I just told him to enter a certain place and exit it just to listen to the musical cues.
Yeah. I think that the effort put into that for such a subtle feature, we didn't continue that. Um, I don't think. I think the dig had some of those subtle cues in it too, but I don't think it is nearly as much as was done in Monkey 2.
But unlike Monkey 2, the Dig had recorded audio, recorded music. So how did iMuse? Because iMuse stayed, I think after Monkey 2, it was in every LucasArts adventure game. How was it interpreted there as opposed to what you did in Monkey Island 2?
You know, I'm not sure exactly how they did it. At Lucas Film, I was only there for 2 years while working on there. We being a handful of us, left the company. Ron and Tammy and Brett and myself. We started up another company uh, midway through. So some of the details on how the dig was done, I thought it still had iMuse in it. But if it
All
had
of the
all
games had
digital,
IMUs,
right? But I don't
Day of
think
the Tentacle as well, and Fate of Atlantis as well. But I think that maybe it was more subtle than what happened in Monkey Island 2.
perhaps.
Anyway, speaking of Monkey Island 2, a couple of months ago, someone on Twitter noticed that in the FM Towns and Mac versions of Monkey Island 2, the whole cliff and fishing pole sequence was completely removed from the game. And so the conversation started on Twitter, and I joined in on the investigation of this issue, and Dave Grossman also joined, and Tammy Borwick, and Tim Schafer, and no one could recall why they did that or why the scene was removed. But all of us were fairly certain that it had something to do with the vertical scrolling in that particular scene, because if you recall, Guybrush has to fish out a map piece from the cliff. Eventually, it was Eric Woolmander who stated that it was truly because of the vertical scrolling that the screen could go up and down, but you couldn't have objects or animations on the screen at the same time as the vertical scrolling itself. So that's why they
Yes,
couldn't
that was.
implement it. Do you remember this issue?
I um, I remember the discussion that you're talking about, which was relatively recent.
Hmm.
At the time, way transitions were done. I mean, we had horizontal scrolling, very jagged horizontal scrolling, and for vertical scrolling, that was done by a fade transition. Normally, you would see wipes left to right and whatnot inside fades. This was a push fade that would just scroll the screen up, and the only thing it was doing during that fade was just copying pixels from one room to the next. And for whatever reason, on the FM Towns, it wasn't performant. Um, and I can't imagine why, because that machine was such a beast in comparison to the PC. It should have been able to do it, but it just wasn't. And on the
So,
Mac side of things, it was definitely a pushing of 640 by 480. Uh, that was the reason. It just wouldn't. I don't think that they could get the 10 frames a second at 640 by 480. So they just took it out of the Mac.
so the difference between the horizontal scrolling and the vertical scrolling was that was the way the pixels were drawn in the movement itself.
Yes, and the SCUMM system had the ability to horizontally scroll. The rooms were wider than a single room width or single screen width, and the system had the ability to pan to the left and right, not smoothly, but at 8 pixel steps. And that was kind of built into the functionality of the running of the game. And the vertical scroll, we didn't ever have a pan up, with the exception of that fade. I think there was some vertical scrolling. No, that was just also shaking the screen. That was done with
Yeah,
the
in the elevator
PAL
at the
pan.
end, but you have vertical scrolling when Guybrush takes Kate capsizes ship to the middle of the ocean, and then he dives down.
Oh, the dive, yeah.
But
I think that was also done with a push fade as well.
there is no actions in that scene, so that scene wasn't removed. While the fishing pole, the cliff fishing pole scene has actions in it, has animations of you fishing for the map itself. And by the way, in the special edition, they removed these vertical scrolling animations, and that's why speedrunners of Monkey Island 2 prefer playing these versions, because it's faster. You don't have the vertical scrolling, and you don't have iMuse.
Interesting. So there's no more delays there as well
Yeah,
for the
so
syncing.
you enter a room, it's loading immediately. So in your time at LucasArts, which LucasArts titles did you work on directly and indirectly?
Well, indirectly is since I worked on all the tools, I never worked on the games themselves unless there was something very minor that they needed. Um, for the most part, it was all tool work. So I worked on all of the games technically that were in production at the time. And so the tools that what I was the one responsible for upgrading things from 16 colors to 256 colors. So all the tool set originally was built around EGA, and prior to that, it was all manually done in uh, Commodore 64 palette before we got EGA. And so we had to upgrade all the tools to support VGA, and under that, everything like Fate of Atlantis and Monkey One and Monkey Two were absolutely in my wheelhouse. Everything that I was doing was for those projects. The Day of the Tentacle also was affected by those as well. So those are the core games that were. I don't think
That
there
you
was
worked on
another one.
directly? Indirectly, I understand that everything
Indirectly,
that
right?
was based on SCUMM was you were credited on, given that you worked on the tools to create it. But while you were there, which titles were released? Monkey Island 2, Fate of Atlantis, and Day of the Tentacle?
Day of the Tentacle, no, it was just starting up when we left. The games that shipped were Fate of Atlantis, Monkey One, Monkey Two. The different platforms for Monkey were the Amiga, the PC, and I think there was another one which I think there was a Tandy computer in there, which I can't remember the name of it. CDI. That was also another SKU that went out while I was there.
And while you were there, they also started shipping talkie versions of various games. In 1992, they released the talkie version of Loom, which used the CD audio for the
Right.
voices. And that was the only game that actually did that. While Fate of Atlantis, which was released the year after, had already digitized voices as part of the sound effects. Now, which changes did you have to do in SCUMM in order to support what they did with Loom, with the CD audio, and
Right.
what they did with Fate of Atlantis and onward with Day of the Tentacle? And
Right. Well, Eric Wilmunder is the one that engineered all of the CD Redbook audio interfacing on that. And geez, what did he do? There were so many different things. CD drives early on, the interface to when you would load data versus when you would play Redbook audio wasn't well defined in the spec. So sometimes when you would start up a sound, or the position of the read head for what data was being loaded would be chucked out. So he had to um, carefully remember where he was at in the reading of data before starting a sound. And then if it got interrupted, it would also have to do lots of timing issue with restarting the sound uh, right at the same position or as close as Eric could get it. Because the timing, it was kind of like you started up a sound and you had knowledge of when it happened, obviously, but you could have a hiccup and, the CD would, skip a beat just for a small amount of time. And that just changed, the timing of things just enough to where um, it would get a little out of sync. And Eric had to work with the fiddly different drivers with that. I remember that. Uh,
And in Loom, in the CD version, they also removed the close-ups for the characters in a lot of the scenes. So I always thought that it was because of the CD audio, that she had to start the CD audio, and at that exact time also change the scene, which probably would have required the CD drive to read from the CD at the same time they started the music. So I always wondered about that, if that was the cause or that was a certain limitation in SCUMM.
that was the limitation. You were doing one or the other. You were either loading data or playing audio. There wasn't a lot of switching back and forth.
So as long as the track was playing, you couldn't do anything in the game that wasn't preloaded into the memory, right?
Correct, unless it was coming from hard drive. If you had installed everything onto the hard drive, then technically it could do it. But since those games were, um, I don't think you had to install. No,
Probably it was a
no,
minimum
a
installation.
minimum install. Yeah,
Yeah. And how long were you in at LucasArts in total? And why did
a
you
total
decide
of
to leave?
A total of 2 years, and I decided to leave, well, Ron decided to leave. So and, I decided to go along with him, based on his plans of, doing some more games, that were using the system. I had invested, a fair amount of my time, all of my time, building all of the new tools and whatnot, and, um, the system wasn't always as um, lauded as it is these days. Um, some people felt it was a burdensome uh, engine to work in because it had certain facilities and ways of doing things that um, the creative staff, in some respects, felt hampered by. Um, So when Ron, decided that he was going to go do some educational software, um, as well as some other types of games, um, it just made sense for me to go with him. Um, the the team was shrinking, if you will, with Ron going, um, and it just made sense. There was no um, reason that I would have not stayed. I mean, if Ron had stayed, I would have stayed as well because I really enjoyed working there. The games were tremendous, and the staff is, you know, talented on every, level. The creative and artistic talents of the place was just incredible. So I would have stayed as long as they would have me.
And how many
But
of you left together to Humongous?
Let's see. There was Ron and Shelley. They were the principals of the company, and there was Tammy Borowick and another person named Brett Barrett, and myself. Those were the key people that were willing to relocate up to Washington uh, during
So
that
you all
time
left
period.
left at the same time, or
Everybody left. Let's see. Ron, Shelley, and Tammy all left early on. Um, I think it was about midway through '92 that they left. I really wanted to stay on so that I could have my 2-year um, anniversary. Um, so it wasn't necessary for me to also leave with them at the time. So I was able to make it to the uh, June date so that I had 2 years there rather than just 1.5. Um, for whatever reason, I liked whole numbers.
And when you moved to Humongous Entertainment, you kept using the SCUMM engine for the Humongous games. How did LucasArts allow that?
Ah, well, that was a smart move on their part. Um, Ron was working on a new version of the compiler during this when they decided that they were going to leave, and Ron approached them and said, "I'm going to continue. I would like to continue this work on the compiler, and since I'm going, maybe we could work out a deal where you get the changes that we make up there, and as an exchange for letting us license the system." And a part of that agreement was that I would come along and also do the tools and maintenance of the tools. Um, so we kind of uh, we shared technology, or at least one direction. We shared it that direction. The Humongous sent things down to LucasArts. LucasArts didn't send us things up. Um,
Yeah, that
we
was my next question. If everything that they did was also sent to you, but I understand that it wasn't. So basically, every new feature you've added, they've just added to the SCUMM system on their part, while leaving you behind technologically.
that is since the majority of the things that I worked up on were the tools, we kept everything binary compatible. So since the tools just basically write out data into the costume format, as we were building new tools up at Humongous, we made sure that it would always kick out a valid costume so that they could use it as well. So it was the tools, weren't embedded into the engine itself. They use these intermediate files, which we made sure that they were compatible, so that they could use them.
So everything that they used was backward compatible. But in case you wanted to compile, I don't know, the dig, for example, with the tools you had, then you couldn't because of new features they probably added, right?
Right. We had things that they had access to, but they had lots of things that we didn't have. I mean, they had a whole engineering staff that we lost, if you will, when we left. It was just Ron and myself instead of, Eric and Vince Lee and Mark Hay Hutchinson, and others as well. That staff stayed. So we didn't have the benefit of all of their engineering effort. Um,
Now, the at Humongous, you've worked on the Fatty Bear games and Butt games, and these games, in addition to the adventure games themselves, had activity packs, which were a collection of mini games basically, without any adventure game elements. And around the same time at LucasArts, Sam and Max Hit the Road also came out. Although it was an adventure game, it also had a few integrated mini games in addition to the adventure game itself. Now, was SCUMM always capable of handling arcade game logic, or was it something that you added during the production of these particular games?
well, it's kind of hard to say. The original Scum system was pretty geared towards making walk talk actors move around with limited background objects, um, and their and scrolling. But as we started getting more horsepower, um, you know, a computer, a 286 is a pretty primitive computer by today's standards. Heck, even by those days' standards, it was pretty primitive. So there was only certain facilities that you could do. There's only so much you could get across the bus to the screen. Um, so as we started getting CPUs, which were much more powerful and faster buses, rather than having an 8-bit bus, which I think had a limit of like maybe 5 or 10 megabytes total that it could send data across. So even if you just sat in a loop, you couldn't send more than 5 megs a second. Even if you wanted to, the computer itself was, limited. Um, as computers grew, so did the facilities that the SCUMM system did. Like we built in things that we called blast objects, which were like objects, but instead of rendering in the old-fashioned way that we used to do it, we wrote new codecs that basically, were much more efficient, not data-wise, but performance-wise, and those would go to the screen much faster. And so using blast objects, if you will, that facilitated more action on the screen. And they were able to use those in mini games, just like we were able to use them in mini games as well. But that really came about from just more horsepower, really. Um, as the computers just got faster, um, and the hardware requirements for the games got a little higher, that just kind of came naturally that you could do more advanced things.
You could do more advanced things, but what about the logics themselves? Did you have to make any changes to, because an arcade game, for example, works differently than walk to and use, pick up, and
Right. There are some things, and actually the compiler changes that Ron was working on uh, in '92, he changed the compiler in its entirety to using rather than variables. Um, variables were still used, but he had a proper stack based math system. So the language itself got more robust. That you could, do complex math instead of doing, an add then a multiply. You could actually do an add and a multiply at the same time in a way that made made it look more like C. So that type of logic was there. The system always had concurrency and the ability to multitask between objects. So you could start an actor walking, and you could have animations going, like the animation of the guy spinning in the scum bar. Um, that was an independent action that was going on as the actors were moving around the screen and whatnot. Um, but the where was it going with that? I don't know where I was going with that.
you're talking about the guy in the chandelier in Monkey Island.
Yes. So those sort of concurrencies were there in the language, but the ability to make a nice calculation of how to move a character much finer than just using walk boxes and the auto navigation. Yeah, that came as the language got stack based math. Um, and that was a new thing for '92, if you will.
And how long were you at the Humongous?
8 years, and it was. I spent a decade on the SCUMM system. That seemed like the perfect time to leave at the time. You know, uh, I was just turning 30, and it seemed like it was time for me to move on and try other things. Um, uh, Looking back on it, I probably should have stayed longer. Um, Humongous definitely could have used me. Um, but a decade seemed like a long time at that time.
Yeah,
So
even now,
yeah,
with job skipping, 10 years is an eternity.
yeah,
Back in 1997, LucasArts released their last SCUMM game, which was Curse of Monkey Island. And were you aware that it would be the last SCUMM game, or you found out later after they started releasing games like Grim Fandango with a grimy engine and Escape from Monkey Island, which was also 3D? So were you
right.
aware at the time that they'll stop using SCUMM at that time?
Yeah, it was clear the pain points of working within the SCUMM language was becoming difficult for the game programmers, especially with on the horizon, 3D hardware was coming up. So that we knew that the games on their side would definitely change. Um, we had technology that Vince had been working on to do full motion video inside Rebel Assault, and that technology made it into the SCUMM system as an underpinning technology. Um, but they the language, showed you know, its age for the types of experiences, and Lua was a much better language for doing some things. And it was fairly clear that they were going to change. Um, so we continue to use it at Humongous, but yeah, they stopped, and rightfully so. Grim Fandango is a fantastic game, and it would have been a very different game had they tried to squeeze all that um, into the SCUMM engine. I would have.
And were you ever asked to add any 3D elements or 3D support to SCUMM at Humongous or from
At
LucasArts?
Humongous, at Humongous, we did have 3D elements that we experimented with, but we always kind of hedged our bets on running on lowest common denominators hardware. So it's like while people were shipping games uh, for Pentiums and whatnot and high-end graphics card, a 6-year-old computer is probably not going to be the fastest computer that the brand new computer that they got for home use for mom and dad probably isn't getting handed directly to the kids. So we kept things really low uh, requirements for the CPU and the RAM and all of that. So we didn't really use it, but we did have the facilities, um, like the animation system. Um, had certain ways of dealing with things, but we also had another pipeline, which was more arcadey, which were sprites and much faster elements. And those, at some point, I hardware accelerated via Direct 3D, and we never really shipped anything with it. Um, I don't know if you saw Moonbase Commander
I saw and I played
from
it.
well, excellent. That is a game that used everything the SCUMM system could do, um, all at once. So everything that is in that game represents the total feature set of the engine. Um,
It's funny that
Everything was
the
used.
game you're giving is an example of a game that uses all of SCUMM's feature isn't even an adventure game. When
This is true.
SCUMM was built for adventure games. Now you talked about DirectX. I presume that during your time at Humongous, you made the switch to Windows from DOS. Which changes did you have to make in the SCUMM system in order to do that?
Oh, there was all kinds of things happened in that transition. We went from DOS to Windows, and that required us to do two things. We had to work within an environment that wasn't DOS, or we historically didn't use a lot of facilities from the operating system um, on whatever platform we were at. We were pretty much in charge of the CPU and graphics card completely. And in Windows, that wasn't the case. We had to um, work within what was there. So that required all kinds of strange architectural changes. Um, the APIs more cooperatively multitasking in Windows, um, but you couldn't just sit there in a tight for loop and wait for things. You had to, service Windows's message every so often. You had to basically kind of handshake with it to say, we're still here and we haven't crashed, and you have CPU cycles to move the cursors and display the graphics. All kinds of little architectural changes inside of that to make that run smoothly. The other thing that we did is that we went high res, 640 by 480 rather than 320 by 200. And that was a huge pushing of data. That's almost, it's almost 5 times as much data. And so we did both of those transitions at the same time. Um, and, the market for a few years after we did, we went to Windows in late 93, which was much earlier than most people. Most people are still sitting in DOS because it was more predictable. Um, so we had to go push more data, push it in a complex uh, environment operating system. And this was before DirectX was even something that it was being thought about, but not being actually publicly discussed. So games and high performance APIs weren't on the horizon when we first started. It was
So at that time, you still had to work on DOS support and Windows support at the same time for every release.
no, uh, we stopped DOS support when we went high res. We dropped everything that was DOS because we decided as a company we needed to be high res and we needed to do hand drawn animation, which kind of pushed us into the high res because it just looked better
Mhm.
at high res. And so we had just come off of working on the 3DO. So we that was our last low res set of projects, and we had gone 16-bit color internally on that. So we were, kind of already going higher resolution, at least higher color depth for the 3DO. Um, and then when we went to make the decision to go to Windows, we first went to high res. Um, and that was super VGA resolution, 640 by 480. And once we made that transition, it kind of just made sense to go to Windows as well. It was kind of like we did some performance tests, and it was possible, just barely possible to achieve, 10 frames a second at 640 by 480. So we decided to do that. Um,
So you made the switch around 93, and I believe that LucasArts made the switch much later. How how did the changes you've done to SCUMM to support these higher resolutions um, work with LucasArts' decision to stick around, to stay with the lower resolution until much later? I think that either Curse, I'm not sure about the dig, but I think that the Curse of Monkey Island was for sure 640 by 400. But the dig wasn't, so it took them a couple of years to reach that point.
yes. 640 by 480 is a lot of data, especially in that time period where we had VESA local bus was just kind of the hot, new technology. We hadn't quite got to PCI bus where everybody was able to just blast tens of megabytes a second across the bus. We were still kind of limited by your low end card had to go over the ISA bus, which has an upper limit. And, just pushing that much data just wasn't feasible. I mean, you could, if all you were doing was simply writing data, it just couldn't do it. Just memcopy couldn't keep up with the frame rates that people wanted at 640 by 480. They stuck around. Well, technology-wise, it made more sense. The dig had been in production for a fair amount of time, and it was probably three-quarters of the way developed by the time we had started making that Windows change, and they wouldn't have abandoned um, any technology that far along or any game that far along. So it made more sense for them to stay in DOS.
So,
You know,
now that you talked about the dig, I'm interested in hearing which of the iterations of the dig did you see while you were at LucasArts?
I saw
Because we had, at first we had
Moriarty,
Noah Falstein, and then Brian Moriarty,
right?
and then Dave Grossman, and then Sean Clark, who actually it was the project lead on the final product. But which of the iterations were you part
I
of?
saw a good majority during the time that I was there was Noah Falstein's uh, project, and it had just gotten handed off to Brian Moriarty about the time I left. He was kind of in a design phase on it, so there wasn't a lot to be seen, and certainly not a lot that they were going to share with me because I was leaving. It was known that I was leaving, so they uh, kept a lot of development kind of separate, if you will, from my department. Um, but yeah, so it was Noah's baby when I was still there, and there wasn't a lot playable. Um, I mean, there was lots of design docs being kicked around, and there was some um, core mechanics that were there working, but it wasn't much of a game at that point when I was still there.
A lot of fans of the dig, including myself, we were so interested in hearing about the previous versions and seeing versions in which there were survival elements and when they had to survive on the island, like find food or whatever. So it was super interesting seeing how the game
It
looked back
evolved.
then. Yeah.
Yeah, there wasn't, from my perspective, a lot of game yet while I was still there. And once we were up at Humongous, the window into what they were doing got dimmer and dimmer, if you will. So it's like they would, if something wasn't functioning, they were, good to complain about it and let us know. Um, but what they were doing with it wasn't uh, our domain, so we didn't get to hear it. Um,
And were there any outstanding bugs in the SCUMM system that you were aware of that made it into some of the commercial releases themselves?
oh, no, nothing that I knew of made it into the game because if we knew about it, we'd fix it. Um, yeah, for the most part, if we knew about a bug, we always fixed it. So nothing that was known went out buggy. We did have some bugs that are absolutely my fault. There's no question about that. There was some stuff that we did which locked the micro channel architecture up because I thought the isolating the bus at some point would have been a good thing to do, but on microchannel architecture, it wasn't a good thing to do, and um, there that went out, but it wasn't known upfront. Um, some kind soul was able to diagnose that for us and go, "Oh, well, you're turning off RAM refreshes here," and that on something that requires semi-manual RAM refreshes um, suffered from that. So um, those were bugs on my fault, my fault for sure.
And you had to
Where
release new versions of those games with
Yeah, they had to patch the exe. And it just basically changed whichever blit primitive was, the offending blitter that was, locking the bus. And Eric was able to do that and patch it quite quickly. So
so this is in the days of the internet or before that? Like, did you
it
have to
was
send out patches on floppy disks?
it was floppy disk. People would. I think actually we did have a dial up. You could dial in and yeah, I don't know. At one point, LucasArts had a wonderful kind of operator system for support. So you would call in and build a not build, but they would bill you as as
Yeah,
you were getting help. Um,
the hint
so
line.
that yes, the hint line that was brilliant. Uh, I think the fans enjoyed it because they were able to get um, support that they would normally be in a magazine or on today and today it would be on the internet. But yeah, I think they had a BBS. I'm pretty sure that they had a BBS. If not, it was definitely put somewhere that somebody could get to. In the early form, I mean, FTP really has been around for a long time, and so is the internet um, in a very primitive way has been around. So some of that stuff was there, but not as easily accessible.
Well, you stayed at Humongous until the year 2000, right?
Yes.
And what
I,
did you do afterwards?
oh, well, I took a long sabbatical after a decade of working. I mean, we worked on a lot of projects at Humongous, and I was I was tired uh, uh, mentally. It was time for a refresh, as a sabbatical. The re refilling the containers of creativity, if you will. And so I did that for a couple of years, and my daughter was just a baby at that point. So I, hung out with my wife and daughter. We lived in um, a house up in the hills of Napa, and that was really good for a long time. It's like I once I kind of emerged from my cocoon, if you will, in about 2003. We went and started doing mobile phone games, and we thought the market was there. A lot of the tools that we had developed, we, me, uh, uh, were kind of geared towards that same market. Not that uh, low res 2D was just perfect for the types of tools that I had written. The types of performance operations that I was used to having to deal with were perfect for things like the Game Boy Advance and early mobile phones. And so I spent a good couple of years chasing the mobile market, and that went nowhere. We built a bunch of games before we decided that there wasn't a market for them. We had a small team of two, and we had artist slash designer and programmer slash designer doing these games. So we built what we knew how to do, which was games. And then we tried to go out and find a publisher for them. And it turns out the market was not there. not for the types of games that we were doing. Like had we had cloned Bejeweled, it would have been there. Or but things that were kind of designed for it, um, without name brand recognition, nobody would go after it, and unless the publisher saw something there, and most of the time they didn't. They were really reluctant to buy into any new franchises and things like that. So we turned and went back to the PC, and I did some games for Beep Industries. We did Flying Leo and another game called Zodiac. Kind of really not very high sellers at the time. So, and then I left Beep and went to iWin, which was a company that did uh, probably their biggest franchise was Jewel Quest and Mahjong Quest. Those are two big franchises done by iWin. And then after that, what did I do? We rebooted the Humongous brand under another company called Nimbus Games, and then
Like before you continue, um, back when you ported the Humongous games, probably ported them to iOS and Android, right?
yes.
So how was it getting back to code that you haven't seen in years, even decades, and porting it to a mobile device that at the time didn't have, or maybe did have, some of the computing power that was available in the 90s?
Oh, you know what? Uh, the Android devices, even their primitive forms in the early 2010, 11, 12 timeframe, were rockets in comparison to what we had in the early 90s. And the amount of RAM by today's standards, you can't imagine an early Android phone having a lot of RAM at 256 megabytes of RAM. Sounds like a tremendously low end phone. But for the SCUMM games, which were designed around an 8 megabyte heap, um, 256 megabyte was like seas of RAM in comparison. So it was quite a comfortable fit. Nothing that we were doing in those games taxed the hardware. Mostly, it was the challenges there were about getting things that were 10 years old at that point to run again. The games were always designed to be recompiled, and unfortunately, that requires you have source. And the Atari archiving process was a little, I don't know what to call it, poor. Pathetic would be another word that comes to mind. Uh, they had the wherewithal to back up everything that they thought was important, but by 2006 they didn't back up things like the servers, um, or at least they didn't archive them in a usable form. So all of the places we had used the servers for storing the version control systems of all the games, basically they were gone. Um, by 2012, they had exchanged hands company-wise enough that they were nowhere to be found. So we had to go through old people's hard drives and beg, borrow. It's like, do you happen to have anything from that time period? Went to everybody that I knew, and we managed to cobble enough to get 6 of the games working, and that was it. That was of the like 40 or 50 titles that we had. Um, we could get 6 working again.
And the porting process did you port everything to Objective-C for iOS or to Java for Android, or did you create some sort of virtual machine and ran the games as is? Because my question regarding the hardware was that, because basically around that time, people who try to cash in on games from the 90s, they usually do a virtual machine, which would take out tons of memory back then, and the game wouldn't run that smoothly. So my question is if you ran a VM or you actually ported the code to
I
Objective-C.
ported, well, I went to a different layer. I did a lot of research, and the people who were doing, um, remember Tony Hawk's Pro Skater on the J2ME phones, like the Nokia, I can't think of what, N-Gage. The company that was behind that had built platform, a platform called Marmalade. And Marmalade was kind of a virtual machine. Well, not even virtual machine. They had some clever people working there, and they figured out how to load flat binaries on iOS and flat binaries, the same one, on Android. So they had this kind of quasi machine, if you will, that would load this kind of ARM binary into RAM and just run it from there. And it provided OpenGL and a really simple audio sound system. And I ported the SCUMM system to target that. And it went fairly smoothly. It took me a couple weeks to get the games up and running, or at least the first game up and running, and took probably another 3 months to get it finished in a shippable shape. And after that, it was mostly finding finding the assets and of the other products to get there. Also, these were CD games, um, so they were designed around 600 megabytes of usable space, and mobile phones. That's where the big technological crunch was. We had to get the games under 100 meg downloadable for some platforms, and some were 50 megs, and then you had to download anything externally to that over 50 megs. Those were challenges. But luckily
What
we
did
had
you compress
CPR.
exactly?
Well, it was the audio, for the most part, was the big compression that we did. We didn't go MP3 or OGG or any of the fancy codecs out there. We went to ADPCM, so everything was 4 bits a sample at the frequency that it was already at. But I made some custom tables for the ADPCM jump tables, and that got it probably within 90% of the 8-bit original audio, and that remaining 10% was, lost, but it halved the size of the audio data across the board. And then the other thing that we did, instead of using the regular binary files that the SCUMM system did, we took all of the data and threw it into more or less zip files. So we would get a cross glob type compression. So that gave us another about 25 to 30% compression over the top of the original compression. So you combine those two, and suddenly we're 150 megabyte product rather than a 300 megabyte product.
And 150 megabyte was enough, or you compressed graphics as well?
The 150 megabytes was enough. Those were the biggest footprint, and so all we had to do is get the initial download to 50 megabytes, which got a lot of the game data itself, and then we would just bring down another asset pack up to 100 megs. Um, so it was actually a really cool project. Marmalade was, because it had the ability to target web OS. So I had a little Palm Pilot phone that you could run the game on. We didn't ship it because Palm OS or Web OS was non-existent in the market, if you will, uh, or not significant. But Android and iOS were easy targets, and it went pretty smoothly, I think. And not for us marketing wise. We
Why
were
not?
well about that time. People were just starting that free to play model, and that people didn't want to outlay $6, which I think $3 to $6 is what we were doing. And they were like, well, I can get a game for free here, and then just unlock it with, $2 after they decide it. So we had to make some concessions in our games. The games weren't designed around a kind of stop and play model, So we went in and did some uh, hacks, if you will, to make some of the games upsellable. So, like in Putt Putt Saves the Zoo, you could get a save one animal, and then we would bring up a paywall, if you will, so that we could get the products into their hands, and hopefully then they would just pay for the $4 product or whatever.
And did it
Um,
work?
it did work. It just didn't work faster than Atari going bankrupt. So we were kind of racing Atari's bankruptcy to reboot the brand and get enough money coming in to basically sustain us and buy the product IP outright. And while we were in the process of doing that, another company came in and did a giant acquisition of a number of things from Atari, and it part of that acquisition was the IP that we wanted. So their bulk purchase of all of that lot was more than our bid, so we lost. Um, but the fun thing is we did reboot the brand. We made it more valuable for them. Uh, Wish we had gone to Steam first. That would have been so much smarter. Yeah.
And have you thought at the time, given that you've had experience with porting SCUMM to using Marmalade to iOS and Android, have you thought of reaching out to LucasArts and actually presenting your solution to porting the SCUMM games to iOS and Android, and maybe they'd be interested in doing the same using your technology?
They have, uh, well, they have a number of fans already doing this for them. Uh, like Aaron has a wonderful new emulation layer for them, and I think it's a smarter approach because it uses the original assets as is. Um, so I think that is a better solution
I know, but
than
this is
what I would
present day.
provide.
I'm talking about back
Oh,
then.
at the time,
Yeah.
back then, no, I hadn't thought about approaching them. At that time, SCUMM VM was. It's funny. We have a lot of complications with SCUMM VM over the years, thanks to Atari did a bad thing. They contracted with a company who did an even worse thing than Atari did, which was they used SCUMM VM internally and didn't um, release the source code back, which is a GPL violation, and they also didn't credit. So insult to injury, they really kind of kicked the hornet's nest, if you will. So SCUMM VM wasn't an option um, for us at that time. So we could only, do a real port. Um,
I see. And around the initial version of SCUMM VM was released around 2001. They recently celebrated their 20th anniversary. Now, when were you made aware of SCUMM VM, and what were your thoughts about it?
oh, I thought it was amazing. The fact that people had cared enough to pull apart the data structures and make an interpreter, uh, that blew me away. Um, and then seeing it actually execute games, which was in the early 2000s. I think it was probably about 2004 when I saw the first, might have been Monkey running around. I think might have been not the DS. It was one of those. I think it was maybe the GP32 platform that they had it up and running on. But seeing Monkey, actually running, I was amazed. I was like, all right, that's pretty cool. And then they managed to just get more and more of the generations of the games running. It's like if you go in and look at SCUMM VM, um, it's layered with compatibility fixes from generation 1 up to generation 8 or 9 of the engine, and it all works. It's pretty amazing stuff.
Did they approach you regarding the inner workings of SCUMM, or did you ever
You know,
contribute to the project?
no, I didn't contribute. Well, didn't contribute anything, mainly because the the NDAs and various things that I've signed over the years, I'm not sure what I'm legally allowed to do. Um, and with that, I'm not sure um, that would be a wise move, to say the least. And I have talked with a couple of people from uh, the SCUMM VM team over the years, given them source code to the U32 stuff that allowed them to get Moon-based Commander working properly, and a couple other header files to illuminate some deep-seated mysteries, if you will. But no, I haven't done anything with it. I look at it occasionally, and I marvel at the complexity of what they've done. Um, it is an amazing work of, I'd say, love, really. I mean, the products uh, really were loved by these people enough to, tear them apart and put them back together in places that they weren't originally supposed to run, which is pretty cool. And I think that even before SCUMM VM, there were some attempts to get uh, it working on targets that it didn't, like the Atari ST. I believe that at some point they ported through blood, sweat, and tears the Amiga uh, port to the Atari ST and got it down to 16 colors. And I don't remember the time frame on that though, but it was pretty impressive work.
And after you worked on mobile games at the beginning of the 2000s, you moved on to working on the Adobe Flash platform, right?
Oh yeah,
And
yes.
can you elaborate a bit on what you used it for, what you produced using the Adobe Flash platform?
Oh, well, at iWin, we used the Flash platform internally for a number of kind of cutscenes, if you will, and maps. Um, so I was tasked with certain, things, um, and out of all of the um, working solutions that they had, Flash made the most sense because we could get the environment and making animations was just much better than what they had. So it made a lot of sense to kind of leverage that. The artists could, work in what they already were drawing the game content in, and it just made more sense to just stay there. Let's see, what did uh, for me personally, I shipped a couple little puzzle games with Flash. Only one was moderately, not even moderately successful. Um, Pathetically market unfriendly, apparently. Um, but yeah, I've got a little puzzle game that I made for my wife that I tried to distribute on iOS and Android, and it did pathetically.
You
Let's see, what
ported
did I
the
do
Adobe
with it?
Flash game to iOS and Android using Adobe
Yes.
Air.
Oh yeah, Adobe Air was a fantastic product. I really wish they hadn't been scared out of the market. Um, they everything that they had going wrong for them with Steve Jobs basically saying this is too slow. I believe that they could have easily fixed it. Um, Adobe has the brain power sitting there and has the manpower sitting there to do it, but for whatever reason they paled at the being called out for being slow. And they could have said, "Yeah, we're slow today, but tomorrow we won't be." And that would have been my approach. Not not to have taken the insult, and I would have at least tried to respond. And they didn't seem to. They're like, "Okay, we're slow.
Yeah.
We'll go away," uh, which is kind of sad. Um, I liked Flash a lot. I mean, I think that the engineering that they had done on it was tremendous. Um, I wouldn't have myself gone vectors just because that's not my particular rendering style. I like bitmaps and whatnot, but the work that they had done for hitting different platforms, it was performant, it was small, it got abused, sure. It had security holes, sure. Uh, but the only reason it was a platform of attack was because it was so widely available. So its own success kind of um, made it a good vector for attack. People would just go after it because everybody has Flash, and most likely they haven't updated to the latest one. So it has this big security hole in it, and you can drive trucks through that and get that that didn't need to take the entire market away. I don't think.
Yeah,
Wasn't
with the roadmap for Flash was really promising back then when Steve Jobs wrote his open letter thoughts about Flash. They had Molehill with the 3D engine coming around that time, and hardware acceleration was also um, better at that stage than at the early 2000s. And as a Flash developer myself, I developed Flash games and Flash websites when Flash websites were popular. Usually, websites for movies had always been full screen Flash websites with scenes from the movie because that was the only way to play video back in the day. In
reliably.
Yeah, so I feel your pain about the withering of the Flash platform, and
Yeah, I think
around that time.
architecturally it was just fine. I mean, I think once they got ActionScript 2 or ActionScript 3, 2 was still kind of ECMAScript, I believe was lightweight JavaScript compatibility. But once they went to ActionScript 3, you didn't have to use the type annotations, so you had a lot of code sharing between that and straight JavaScript. Um, so it was great, and the way you could nest things inside Flash um, meshed really well with the types of solutions that I had always come up with. Thanks to uh, the years of working with animations and trying to squeeze them down. I would say Flash's display list technology was more robust than what we had in the SCUMM system in a lot of ways. But um, we had things that, like some of the things that we did at Humongous, actually, this is kind of a fun one. Um, you know how inside Flash you could have different symbols and whatnot? And we would do something similar to that where we would decomposite scenes, flat 2D art, and we would create these things that we called component pages. And so we would chop up art into things that you reused, and the tools through pull things apart. Like, okay, this is an item that is always occluding this other item, and so we just kind of layer the pieces or unlayer the pieces and do this recursively. So we were kind of used to having highly componented pieces of art, kind of multi-sprite, if you will, and that same type of mechanic and production kind of flow worked really well in Flash, because you could nest uh, things to your heart's content. And if you did hardware acceleration, you could flatten the movie into a bitmap and then just split that, and it was just as fast as could be. So
Yeah, back then they started adding cache as a bitmap for symbols in the library, because vector animation, if you used it in full screen and in the resolutions back then, it could have been very CPU heavy. And yeah, I'm still a bit sour about Flash.
I'm surprised that the people who licensed Flash from, or not Flash, but Adobe Air,
Mhm.
haven't targeted WebAssembly. I really am kind of shocked that they haven't made a direct port to just going straight to that.
Well,
Um,
currently Adobe
you
Air
know,
is you need to license it. It has a yearly payment
yes,
or monthly payment. So,
yeah, I think it's $500 starting,
mhm.
and then they have a contact us if you if you make more than $100,000 a year,
Yeah.
because we want part of that.
But
Yeah,
even
it is
now,
a shame.
more than a decade later, there aren't any tools that can compare with what uh, the Adobe Flash, which became Adobe Animate environment in HTML5. So nowadays, with Flash, what I loved about it was the timelines inside the objects themselves. They could run independently. And I saw a similar thing whenever I would extract assets from a SCUMM game. I would notice that, the head of Guybrush would have its own animation, and then the body would have its own animation. And then you just piece it together. And, even if the head had 5 frames to loop through and the body had like 20 frames, they'd still sync up perfectly, and each one would have their own timeline. So you had that back in the 90s in SCUMM. We had it in the 2000 in Adobe Air, and now we just don't have it.
Yeah, it is a shame. I wish that I could take the projects that I have and just recompile them. Lately, for whatever reason, even the old Air SDK doesn't run anymore. It just basically craps out. I don't know where it craps out. It gets a not a seg fault, but pretty darn near a seg fault in its compiling process, and I can't you know seem to resolve it. I've tried reinstalling and getting the latest Java patch, and nothing. I guess I would have to go back to a virtual machine to to get it to work. I don't know.
So, do you have any of the big boxes of any of the games that you've worked on?
I do. I have. I'm looking right across the room at them. I have a couple Monkey Island 1 and 2. One is, I think, Italian. I have a Loom and Then I have all of the Humongous products in boxes, which is a slightly larger set of boxes.
So from
Uh,
LucasArts, you have Monkey and Loom.
Monkey and Loom and Indy. That's what I can see from here. Oh wait, there's a Maniac Mansion. Huh, a 5 1/4 Maniac Mansion as well.
So you don't have any of the games you actually worked on, because Maniac Mansion came out before, and Monkey came
No, I got
when.
that.
So you got them before you started
I
working there.
I got those as they were translating things. We would get boxes of uh, products occasionally, and the ones that I have left were the ones that I hadn't given away. Over the years, basically, I've given boxes of the stuff away. Didn't think
For
that would
free?
really. Oh yeah, to friends and family over the years, and I only have a handful of the stuff that
You
from
could have made
LucasArts.
millions on eBay.
Hundreds of dollars.
So speaking of translations, you have the Italian version of Loom,
I think it's Italian of it's Italian of something. I can't make it out from here.
and you worked on these translations. You had to make some adjustments on SCUMM for them.
No, it was just them being kind and saying, "Hey, we got some products. Would you like to give these out to your friends?"
And
So,
I have the Hebrew version of Loom, which was released around 91, at the end of 91, at the beginning of 92. And so you were at LucasArts back then. And I wondered if you had to do anything to support right to left text in the game.
me personally, no, I was not not forced to do that, thankfully. The font
Someone was.
system. Yes, somebody was tasked with writing the font renderer, and that was not a friendly piece of code. I definitely say I am happy to have not had to do that.
Well, maybe your font tool was actually put to use. Even though you just used 3 fonts, you had
Yeah,
another one.
maybe. Or they went and did something smart like use the OS to render it somehow. uh, use the character set built into ROM, to get those characters. Um, yeah, but right to left reading was something that was not supported, directly by the engine.
Even we
That's for
had
sure.
operating systems that didn't support it until years after. Windows
Yes,
95, we had to wait like a year after, for them to release a version that supported right to left text.
yes. Unicode came surprisingly late, in our history, um, everybody's history. And it's like the ability to display, you know, anything that isn't the, typical, you know, U.S. centric, ASCII. It was
It's usually
pretty,
according to the size of the market. So
yeah,
supporting right to left doesn't have that big of a market, or didn't have at the time.
that's true. Although today's the world is a big place, and I would say that LucasArts made some really smart decisions in their marketing of getting German translations and French and Spanish. Um, those were just brilliant moves. I'm,
Yeah, and Sierra
kind of
didn't do.
surprised I'm surprised that they kind of stopped doing that after a certain point. They, I think that some of the later products didn't get any translations because they just weren't selling that much. So
And Sierra didn't do the same, and that's why LucasArts is more popular in Europe, and Sierra is more popular in the US. I mean, for me, I my first Sierra game was well after I started playing at least 5 or 6 LucasArts games, And it was probably because of the text parser for Sierra, because translating a text parser is much more difficult than just translating a bunch of verbs or sentences of dialogue inside the game itself. While building a text parser in every language is probably complicated.
Indeed.
Speaking of Monkey Island, did you play Return to Monkey Island?
I had to borrow my daughter's Switch, and I
Mhm.
got probably a good 20 minutes of it under my belt before she wanted her Switch back. So I haven't played it very far. What I have played, I really enjoyed. I love the look of it. I think it's fantastic, and the story-wise, I can't comment on. It was, I haven't finished it, so I don't really have a lot of insight there. But what I did see, I liked a lot.
And did you like the changes that they did to the interface, given that there aren't verbs, just like they had in Monkey Island 1 and 2? And there isn't a verb wheel like in Monkey Island 3. And there's just two actions for the right click and the left click. Did you like that interface, or?
I liked it. I liked how it offered them up some opportunities to put in hints and have the characters kind of comment on what you're doing as you're doing it. So the just way you play it, I think, is pretty simplistic and to the point, which is exactly what they wanted to do, I think. So I have no complaints about it.
Now, before we move to a few questions from our viewers, I have a personal note I'd like to make. Looking back, SCUMM had and still has a huge impact on my life. SCUMM games have taught me English. I played Maniac Mansion and Zack McCracken at a very young age. And back then I didn't understand the word, but I learned what the verbs themselves meant in order to be able to progress in these games. And the same goes for the inventory items. While later games such as Monkey Island 2 and Day of the Tentacle and Indiana Jones and the Fate of Atlantis and Sam and Max basically enriched my vocabulary. And I played the talkie versions of Fate and Sam and Max, which also helped me to learn proper pronunciations of certain words. And a year ago, I introduced the adventure game genre to my daughter by letting her play the Hebrew versions of the Putt Putt games. She played Parade and Moon and Race and Circus. And nowadays, she's learning English by playing the original versions of these games, which also include Zoo and Through Time. So I wanted to personally thank you for your contribution to SCUMM and your contribution to our knowledge of the English language for 2 generations in my family, both mine and my daughter's.
Well, that's fantastic. I think that's great. I'm glad that they have enriched uh, more so than diminished over the years. So that's great. That is very cool. I'm really surprised at did you emulate them for the original DOS products uh,
You're
via
asking
like?
the Putt Putt games?
Uh-huh. Yeah. How did
They
you have them play?
I have the I got the floppy disk versions and I ran them on SCUMM VM.
Oh, okay. All right. That makes sense.
So back
Of course you
then,
did.
unlike the Loom Hebrew version, which had to translate the text, in the Putt Putt games that it didn't translate any of the text. The text that was on screen was still in English, the signs and whatever, but the voiceover was translated.
Yeah, we
And
did all voice in those little products, which really, well, the age range wise, you know, kids understand uh, audio much better than they do, written word. So that makes most sense.
Okay, so before we wrap up, I have two questions that I've chosen from our viewers. One, Sprite Anon asks, if you had to pick a favorite adventure game you were directly involved with, and another you weren't directly involved with, but which was built on your work, either by using the SCUMM engine or something following the same spirit, what would those be?
Well, I think my favorite game that LucasArts did was I didn't have, other than just them using my tools. Day of the Tentacle, I really like. I think it's just visually a great game. I think story-wise, it's great. And I think environmentally, it's really cool. So Day of the Tentacle from the LucasArts stuff. And on Humongous' side, I think Putt Putt Saves the Zoo is my overall favorite, because it's the first game that we did that kind of really felt solid. I mean, like it's just a good experience all the way through. Um, and
Story
Freddy's,
wise or feature wise? What?
just the way it feels, it's well put together. There isn't a lot of sad points. I mean, there's a couple uh, things that I like in the hockey game. I think that we could have done a little bit better with it, um, in a couple things. But at the time, we did as well as we could. Um, but comparing it to like Freddy Fish, the characters weren't on model in Freddy Fish very often. Because it was like our first product that we did. But Zoo Putt stays really consistent throughout. The story's cute. The gameplay is simplistic, but understandable, and enjoyable. Uh, and let's see. And the final game out of that, I'm most proud of, I think, Moonbase, just because it used everything. Everything that we ever thought it could do, it showed that it could do it. And Rhett was a brilliant man, and he pushed it farther than I think anybody should have. Uh, One of the things that he most amazed me with was the rendering of the background elements. At one point, he actually was using like put pixel commands in SCUMM to render out the core bitmaps for his background elements. So there was a point in time where there was a raycaster written in SCUMM sitting inside that game, which that's pretty cool that he was able to actually do it. Um, Not fast, but he was able to do it.
Well, it was 2001 or
Yep.
2002, so you know he did what he could with the technology of that time.
Yes.
And Right Said Brett asks, you have a long and storied collection of games under your belt across multiple genres, which you've worked on. What is your proudest moment within the industry, and which genre, if any, do you prefer to program for? Now, I presume that the proudest moment was Moonbase. So
Yeah.
I'll ask the second question. Which genre, if any, do you prefer to program for?
You know, Design wise, I like puzzle games more so than adventure games at this point. Um, I enjoy building tools, animation tools. So anything that is animated is what I like to do. If I had to do a tool today, I would make Spine, the 2D animation tool Spine. I mean that's what I would do. Um, Matter of fact, I don't see any reason to write a tool with Spine's existence. Um, I mean, it does everything I would want it to do, and you can annotate over the top of it, so you can add to it via that. So animation tools is what I like the most, and however they're used uh, is uh, is fine with me. Regardless of genre, as long as it's done well. Um,
Well, Brad, thank you so much for joining me today. It's been a pleasure talking to you, and an honor to talk to you about the behind the scenes process of creating these classic games, which were a part of my childhood, that now my kids' childhood. So thanks.
Well, thank you for having me on. I have enjoyed this. Hopefully your users get something out of it. So thanks.
And that concludes today's dialogue with Daniel. Many thanks to Brad Taylor for taking the time to chat with Daniel. I thought it was a great interview. I hope you did too. And hey, I have a question for you guys. Are you enjoying these interviews? Are you enjoying the fact that we're reaching out to these wonderful artists and programmers and designers and talking to them about their part in making this incredible history of games that we all love so much? Are you enjoying our weekly streams that we do of playing these games? I hope you are. And if you do, I have a request to make. We are completely funded by donations via our Ko-fi website and our Patreon members. If it wasn't for these people donating on a regular basis, we would not be able to continue this project. And like anybody who is giving donations on a regular basis, there are ebbs and flows. People jump in, they give what they can, and then they jump out. So we are in need of a little more flow right now. For us to continue into 2023, we would like to see our donations, our Patreon memberships go up a little bit. So if you are in a position for just a little while to jump onto Patreon or to give a nice donation via Ko-fi, we can't tell you how much we'd appreciate that. We want to continue to grow. We want to continue to do what we're doing. And the only way to do that is through support from people like you. So if you have a little to give, please do so. And until then, thanks for everything. And we will see you on our next conversation with Curtis. All right. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.